Welcome to Old Path and our study through the New Testament. We are currently studying through the book of Hebrews, and we're at chapter 7 today. So I've already got a smile on my face because of the content of this chapter it's so intriguing, and anybody who's gone through this and studied it a little bit knows that when we start talking about this character who's already been mentioned in the book, actually the last chapter ended off mentioning Melchizedek. But this person, Melchizedek, this is the first chance that we've had really to kind of dive into who he is from what we know. And again, it is intriguing because there are so many, well, not so many, but there are some main theories about who exactly he is. And so the important part of this, though, is to realize that as far as the text goes, there are only 3 books that mention him. And the 3 books are, as we've already looked at, the book of Psalms. It's actually only in one of the Psalms, which is in Psalm 110. And then, of course, we get mention of him very, very briefly in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis. We're going to go to those. And then, of course, there is this here in Hebrews. And really, the book of Hebrews deals more with this person, Melchizedek, than any of the other books, all of those other 2 combined, by a long shot. And so what we know of him historically is only found there in Genesis. And what we have about him, and really what David sees as a discussion that there is between what we would believe is the God the Father and Jesus the Son. Clearly there's only one way that can be seen, and the book of Hebrews applies it that way, applies that Psalm 110 and makes it about Jesus, and that the Father sent him as the only begotten to do exactly what he does as being our great high priest. So all of that is being woven into what we have here in the book of Hebrews. And interestingly enough, the writer of Hebrews has more to say about attributes of Melchizedek than Genesis actually does. So the discussion that there is about him and the little bit we know of him from Genesis is incredibly brief, and it leaves more questions than it answers. And I believe that is absolutely deliberate. And deliberate on the side that God did not want that to be something exhausted, but rather it leaves it completely open to what the writer of Hebrews does. And so God is obviously knowing all of this in advance, and so he wants this this person Melchizedek, as he is presented in the book of Genesis, to be, again, very, very interesting and intriguing, but without any kind of detail. I believe that, again, all of that is deliberate because the book of Hebrews would be written down the road. God sees all of that in just kind of almost like a timeline, and he's able to see it all at the same time. So God is able to introduce briefly this man without much information whatsoever in Genesis, and then take the book of Psalms and say it's going to be attributed, this person Melchizedek, as a type that he is there in Genesis. And then David is able to record for us what he sees as a discussion between the Father and the Son, and that God could send his only begotten here as a priest and as a king, which is outside of anything that the law would have ever prescribed. And then the person who writes the book of Hebrews is able to take both of those things and make an application to the person of Jesus and show how he is unique in all of human history. And for so many different reasons, he obviously is. But again, for the argument's sake, as a Jewish writer writing to a Jewish audience, this is monumental. It's incredibly important. So for us, once again, it's a good time for a reminder of this. If most of the audience that's hearing me say all these things are Gentiles, then it's an interesting, it's a fascinating, it's a theological, interesting kind of, we can be a third-party observer of this. But as a Gentile, it's not as important to us, though it's vital that we understand how Jesus is able to represent the church as our high priest. All of that is incredibly important, absolutely. But again, if you're trying to let people know from a Jewish perspective why going back to the law is completely off the table to the Jewish person if they want to be right before God, the writer of Hebrews here says, you guys need to understand that as far as our high priest is concerned, we no longer have one. So as a Jew to another Jew in the New Testament sense, we have to look beyond the the priesthood of Aaron because it no longer is able to do what we want it to do. We have to look to a priesthood that is outside of that. And this right here, he's able to explain how Jesus is after a different order entirely, and that is of a different type, of a different manner. And so what we want to do is compare those up, and that's what I want to start out here before we look at the text. And I want to take a look at the first two examples, that in Genesis and then that which is in Psalm 110, and then the one that we have before us in the book of Hebrews. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we're going to go to, first of all, we will go to Genesis chapter 14. We may as well turn there now. And so turn to Genesis 14. And I have crows outside of my my office here, or my room where I'm recording. So if you hear them, it's a little warm up here, a little warm and cold. Right now in Texas, it's about 40 degrees outside, so I've got long sleeves on, but they can get stuffy in this room if you're wondering. And if you can't even hear them, you probably don't care about any of that anyway, do you? So chapter 14 of the book of Genesis. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we're going to take a look at these things characteristic. And I'm going to go ahead and put up just something if you want to screenshot it or write it down however you want to. But we're going to take a look at the big picture things that are shown to us in the text as we take a look at it. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We pray that you would give us understanding hearts and minds and ears, and that we would be able to know why all of these things matter. And even for the believer in the New Testament sense, as a Gentile, the fact that Jesus does what he does is very, very important to us, and we need to understand how that is. But to the Jewish mentality, the importance of knowing who Jesus is and how he can be a king and a priest must be understood through your word. So we ask, God, that you would give us understanding hearts and minds again as we study through these things, realizing it's your Holy Spirit who leads and guides. And so we ask for your assistance in this, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so one last little thing. Let's make sure that we don't realize or that we don't think for some reason that this is somehow trivial. In fact, what is being presented here by the writer of Hebrews is so crucial to a Jewish understanding, because what they know is that God would never say anything and then somehow find a loophole in it. The one thing that if God is going to give his word on a particular matter, he's going to see through, follow that through to be sure that it's literally fulfilled. And so that's, again, it's hugely important that we understand that. So if God says through the law that only those who are of the tribe of Levi and direct descendants of actually Aaron himself, they could not serve not only as a priest, let alone being a high priest. So if you're a Jewish person saying Jesus is our high priest, a Jewish person would be able to say that is impossible. God said that only the priest and the high priest had to be direct descendants of Levi. And so that's just not, it won't work. The law would preclude Jesus from being, or exclude rather, Jesus from being a part of that. It would be impossible. Okay? That's a valid point, and it cannot be disputed because the law is the law and God would never contradict himself. So that presents a huge problem for the Jewish person, not only trying to defend Jesus as the high priest, or the person who would say there's no way he could be. So then what is the solution? Well, the solution very clearly is Melchizedek. And so when we start to think about who Melchizedek is and when he's saying the things that he's saying and doing the things that he's doing, it's Genesis 14, and that's squarely in the time of Abraham. And so that's where we are right now. Now, if you want to get the backstory to it, a very interesting event had taken place, and that's what you get earlier in the chapter 14. Let me give you the exact reference for it. It really kind of starts, actually, it's the whole of chapter 14. So it's a quick read if you want to. Where we're focusing in on verse 18. So the 17 verses explains what happens, and Lot and Abraham at the time would have been living in the southern parts of what is Israel, kind of just again as a sojourner, but again, a very, very prominent man. there are these kings of the south around Sodom and Gomorrah where Lot was living. And there were these kings that were up in the north outside of Israel, more in what we would consider the area around Syria. And there were 5 kings that are mentioned in this. So long and the short of it, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding areas were really kind of having to answer to those kings up in the north, and they rebelled. That's what we get in chapter 14. So they come down, make war, and they take spoils, including people from that area of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot is among them. And so the kings are defeated in the south. The kings of the north go away. They start to head back to where they are. Abraham takes only 318 men with him, and he goes after his nephew. And so it mentions that they go as far as Dan. Interestingly enough, on our trips to Israel, we get to Dan, the city of Dan, which is the northernmost part of what would have been the territories when we think about them all the way back to the time of the law, and when there was the tribal allotments, Dan settled in the north. But more importantly is before that time, it was used, and it was a place that was occupied and lived in all the way back to Abraham's time. And there is even to this day the ruins of a gate that is there that we get a chance to lay our eyes on. I can't touch it because it's very, very old. But it goes back to these times of Abraham. And actually, if you were inside the city of Dan and you were going towards Damascus, this is the gate you probably would have left out of, because it faces kind of to the northeast in the direction you would go if you were headed towards Syria and Damascus in particular. So you'll know what he ends up doing if you read through the chapter. He pursues after his nephew. And he engages these 5 kings and defeats them, again, with 318 men. It sounds absurd and ridiculous until you read what is here, which we will be reading in chapter 14. So that is your backstory to it. Abraham is pursuing after his nephew and wanting to attack those kings and take back the plunder that they had taken from their time down there. Again, Abraham as a single person, as a man, and a group of men of a little over 300 is going to take on kings that have just defeated 3 kingdoms in the south. That just gives you an idea of how miraculous his victory would be over these kings and over their armies, and being able to not only subdue them, but to defeat them and to take everything back. That's what happens here, and that's where we see this person, Melchizedek, brought into the discussion. So let's turn to verse 18, and that'll get us where we're looking at. So I'm going to put up this right now. I'm going to put up these little pieces. We're just going to read these verses together, and we're going to start with this here in verse 18. Then we're going to turn to Psalm 110, and then we're going to get to Hebrews 7. And I'm just going to leave these up, and I want to put them up just so that we can understand the differences between the verses and the characteristics that are said about either Melchizedek or what it says of Jesus after the order of Melchizedek. So let's put up the first one, which is Genesis 14. And look at what it says here. Verse 18, Then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High, which is El Elyon, the God Most High. So it tells us that he, Melchizedek, blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High. So this is Melchizedek pronouncing a blessing over Abram. And he says that blessed is he. That means, that's favor. That's that he enjoys the favor of God. Blessed is he of God Most High. God Most High, who is, the second part of verse 19, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And that's a recognition that God has been the one who has given victory to Abram. And then notice what it says right after that. And he, meaning that Abram, gave him, Melchizedek, a tithe of all. That's going to be a very major part of when we get to the book of Hebrews. So let's take a look at these again. That slide that you see up on your screen. The things that we see here is that he is the king of Salem, which means of peace. And so if he is the king of peace, here's where people start to get really, really intrigued by who this person actually is. Because, most people, and even from as far back as old scholars as you can get, are pretty much the consensus is that where they meet, this king of Salem would be what we would consider Jerusalem. And so Salem is right in the name of Jerusalem. And when you say Jerusalem, you just think the translation that you'll get, what does Jerusalem mean? Of course, peace is actually in the name of it, but Jerusalem would be the foundation or the teaching or the place of peace. So if this person, we certainly know at very, very minimum, he is a type of Jesus Christ, and we get that for a number of reasons, which we'll develop as we start to go through this. So again, where does Abraham meet him? If he's the king of peace, it makes sense that they would be probably somewhere in the area of Jerusalem, because if they're retracing their steps and they've come from Dan, they come down south, they would be passing through the area around Jerusalem on their way down to the southern parts where they get back more towards Sodom and Gomorrah or Beersheba, those places where we know Abraham was living in the southern parts. So however it may be, they are greeted by this man Melchizedek, and he has these titles. So he is the king of Salem, or the king of peace. And interestingly enough, when we think of Jesus as being the prince of peace, also we know that he's the king of kings and lord of lords. You can see where people start to get really intrigued by who this person is. The second part of it says that he's a priest of the Most High, El Elyon. And then the third of those things is that he is presented as being greater than Abraham or Abram. And that's really developed more when we get to the book of Hebrews. So those are the major takeaways, if you will, from Genesis. Now let's go ahead and turn to the passage that we have in Psalm 110, and we'll get a little further into this. Now, as I'm talking about this, I want to point out from chapter 5, we have actually two psalms that are mentioned, one without mentioning him as Melchizedek or mentioning Melchizedek by name. And so when we look at verse 5 of Hebrews chapter 5, it says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." It's part of that. It's a quote. Actually, the whole thing in verse 5 says, "So also Christ did not glorify himself, but became high priest, but it was said of him," or to him, "You are my son, and I today have begotten you." That's from Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. And then verse 6, we've already heard this quoted because it says, and he also says in another place. So the writer of Hebrews says, and also, you can look at Psalm 110, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." Now we get that part from verse 4, where we see in Psalm 110, "The Lord has sworn and he will not relent." He's not going to go back on this. It's a swearing that he has done. Where this is what David sees is the Father speaking to the Son, "You are a priest forever," in that everlasting sense, and it is according to, or it is after the line of Melchizedek. And so that's the important part. He doesn't have to. It's a complete bypass of Levi, and then, of course, of the descendants of Aaron. So the important part of this, once again, it is that we look at the text and recognize what is being said here. Jesus is able to be seen as a high priest functioning in and according to the line that is given through this Melchizedek, who predates, goes all the way back to Abraham, predates any of the tribes because there were none of these children born. So think about this. When David writes what he writes, he's looking back to an event that was Abraham before he even had children. And yet there is the promise that there is a forever priest that comes through this line of Abraham, and that person is the person of Jesus, but he is going to function by a priesthood that was already in operation before there was ever a New Testament priesthood. Again, Abraham had not had Isaac, nor had Jacob been born to Isaac, nor the sons of Jacob, including Levi and Judah. And they hadn't gone through their 400 years plus in Egypt of their slavery, and they had not even come back into the land yet. So we're talking about 2,000 years from the time that Abraham heard this until Jesus actually came and took upon himself a body of flesh and blood. So as we read this verse from Psalm 110, remember that he is referred to as the Lord, and that is Adonai. So when Yahweh says to Adonai, "Today you are you're a priest rather forever, according to the order of Melchizedek," that is the Father speaking to the Son. So if we were questioning that, does that really mean, how do we know that Yahweh speaking to Adonai is the Father speaking to the Son? The book of Hebrews explains that and quotes it in its direct citation, and makes it applicable to the person of Jesus. So in essence, it's this. The writer of Hebrews says, if you're wondering who was being spoken to and who was speaking there in the Old Testament book of Psalms, let me help you out here. The writer of Hebrews says that was the Father speaking to the Son, because he throws in that verse from the second Psalm, "You're my Son, this day I have begotten you." So we understand that he's the only begotten. That's all taken care of in the Gospel of John, that we beheld his glory as the only begotten of the Father. That's verse 14 of John chapter 1. So Jesus being the begotten of the Father is well-worn territory, especially in the New Testament. So this New Testament writer of Hebrews looks back at the history of things and says, this Melchizedek, fascinating guy, we know very little about him. He's very briefly mentioned, and then there is this discussion and this, if you will, charge given by the Father to the Son. You are a priest. You will serve as a priest according to Melchizedek, long before there was Levi, long before there were the sons of Jacob. So he's also, we see this as far as that, he is also, this Lord that is being spoken of here is a conqueror, because he's going to make his enemies his footstools. The footstool. The Father will make the enemies of, well, let's say it this way, Yahweh will make the enemies of Adonai his footstool. And we see that, if we want to know where the fulfillment of that is, look at chapter 19 of the book of Revelation, when Jesus comes back as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, yet he's also got the title as priest, and that's a very important part. So he's a priest, again, as we look at this little slide from the Melchizedek of Psalm 110, and that he is after the order or the line that comes from this person of Melchizedek. When did that line start? No idea. Did it ever end? Clearly it didn't, because it's a forever. It is going to be a line of priests that really culminates in the person of Jesus, but that's the forever part of it. So, interesting, we get to the book of Hebrews, and let's read the first 3 verses, because there is more to this understanding. So let's go ahead and start at verse 1, and we're going to read the first 3 verses, because the first 3 verses really deals with his qualities or his position, this person Melchizedek. Who and what is he? So here we get this. For this Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God, already covered in Genesis, those parts are already told to us. This is the one who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and he blessed him. We understand that again from the book of Genesis. To whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being translated the King of Righteousness, and then also the King of Salem, meaning that he is the King of Peace. Now that's commentary that we have on what we read there in Genesis. So the writer of Hebrews gives some explanation about his titles. He's the King of Salem, and that he is God of the God Most High, the King of Righteousness. These are all titles that are said by the writer of Hebrews, making proper application to the things that are said about him there in Genesis. Now notice what he says here in verse 3. This is where it becomes incredibly interesting. It says that he is without father, that he is without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days, nor end of life, but he was made like the Son of God, and he remains a priest continually, or in that sense, forever. So let's look at this slide in Hebrews 7, and then we'll just go back and we'll start to look through the actual text. So it tells us that he is the King of Salem. This is what we get from Hebrews 7, or that King of Peace. He is the priest of the Most High, and that is a continual forever. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, but God Most High, El Elyon. He's the King of righteousness, and he is the King of peace. And those are the titles because of where he comes from. And, again, looking back at Genesis 14, he is referred to as the King of righteousness, and he is the King of peace. He has no father or mother. That just means he has no genealogy. Now, at very minimum, it means he has no genealogy. And then we're going to get into who is this? Because he's so mysterious. He has really no family tree or descendants. That's, you don't know where he's come from and where did he come from and father, mother. There's just no genealogy that's given. And again, since you're really confined only to Genesis 14, you can look as hard as you want to, and you will not find any details on him. Now, it is important as kind of a caveat to look back and say there are those people who would point to extra biblical writings as maybe a clue as to where he or who he is, and we'll get to that. Now, it tells us no family tree or descendants, and then he has no beginning or ending of life. Now, we'll get back to what all of that means. So hopefully you got a chance to screenshot those, and you can keep them and look at them later on. If you're interested, you can just kind of extrapolate all of that right from the text. So these things that are said about him, again, let's look back at these, especially in this verse 3. Without father, without mother. Now, here's the important part of that. It's what we want to make sure we understand. There are two ways that you can look at this. It means that literally looking at it, just as we see it right there, well, no father, no mother, that means in the earthly sense. So here's where it starts to become very, very interesting for people. Is this Melchizedek, is he just a very, very mysterious and interesting figure who was just very much human and, just had this insanely prominent kind of position, and he served as a priest and of a priesthood that we know absolutely nothing about. So let's look at here's the three options. He either is just a normal human being, but he's very mysterious, and the idea that he doesn't have father and mother means we just don't know who they are, not that he's supernatural in any sense. And so that's also why he wouldn't have genealogy. We don't know when he was born. We don't know when he died, and that's just a way of saying we don't know enough about him to say here's his mother, his father. This is when he was born. This is when he died. So there are people who will look at it and say he's very mysterious. He's very, very prominent. He's very important, and even Abraham is subservient to him or sees him as the greater. And we're going to get that here in just a moment. And then there are others who would say, well, no, this is actually a Christophany, or Melchizedek is really just Jesus before we knew him as Jesus, and he makes this appearance in the Old Testament. So some people would say, well, that's impossible. Well, clearly it's not, because Jesus takes on a body of flesh and blood as we know it 2,000 years ago. So is he able to take on a form as a human? And there are some other places that Abraham and Jacob and others have where they meet these figures that clearly are not just angels because of how they are are seen and how they interact with this person in particular. Jacob is a great example of that. He worships this person that he would think is an angel, and that angel does not correct him, but he receives and accepts his worship, and we know that no angel would do that. If it's an angel and worship is trying to be given to them, they will stop that in its tracks. Wait a minute, you worship no one but God. We get a good glimpse of that in the earlier verses of chapter 19 of Revelation. Before Jesus comes back to earth, John sees all these things and he falls down to worship that angel. He says, wait a minute, don't you do that, get up. I'm a servant just like you are, worship Jesus. So we can look at that and just, man, this person, Melchizedek, is a very interesting person. Could he be Jesus before we knew him as Jesus? And was he actually the one who was in that body interacting with Abram? Certainly, we can make that case as well. It's an easy enough thing to do. Then you get into extra biblical writings, Talmud and other writings where there is the belief perhaps that this is actually nobody other than Shem, and Shem as in the son of Noah. And so again, there's no biblical reason to believe that. It's only in the extra biblical writings that you will get, and that's just one of the possibilities. And there's also another, not just in the Talmud, but in a book that is referred to as the Book of Jasher. And what we do know is that the Book of Jasher is one of those that gets mentioned, and yet the one that we have that people can go ahead and look at is a fabrication from like the 1800s. So again, not credible enough sources. They're either tradition or just a fabricated book that's written that would say that this person, Melchizedek, is actually just Shem. But again, if that was the case, and if it was in fact Shem, then he would have been identified as that. But the book of Genesis tells us that he has no father or mother that we could know. Well, we would certainly know that his father would be Noah if that was the case. So there's just no reason for me personally to look at it as that way. So what camp do I fall in case you even care? I would lean towards thinking, yeah, he very well could have been Jesus in the Old Testament sense, a Christophany, that he appears before we knew him as Jesus. But again, all of this is only important because what is written there in Genesis makes this whole line of discussion in the book of Hebrews really, really important. And I'll do a little stop right here and just say, we want to be very, very careful when we look at this text and recognize that that the writer of Hebrews will I think show us why this is important, rather than what ends up happening most of the time when people look at this. We got to try to figure out who it is. What are our possibilities? What are all that? The writer of Hebrews doesn't even involve himself in that whole line of discussion. Why does he bring it up, and why does he make such a big deal of it? He's going to explain why this is an important issue. Because again, remember, Jewish man writing to a Jewish audience, why is this important, this Melchizedek person? And he wants to point out the importance of his priesthood and why he's able to function as that priest. But then also, if you're going to try to be speaking to a Jewish audience, think of the people that are there in their history and their most prominent figures that they would have through the ages. The whole thing begins on the covenant that is made with Abraham, or Abram at the time. So who is there in all of Judaism, historically speaking, that has the most prominent of positions? And you can come up with a whole handful of very, very influential and important people in history. But when you talk about the nation and the Jewish people and the descendants that come from, that all starts with Abraham. And that's why it's so incredibly significant. So going back to that time, incredibly important. Is Moses important? Absolutely so. Because again, another covenant was made with him. And in that covenant, there was a priesthood. That's a big deal. And that's really the whole argument that would be here. And I pointed to it at the beginning. Well, what about this guy? How is it that Jesus is going to be of a line that would be able to serve as a priest? Well, there's this man Melchizedek, and clearly Jesus could not serve as a priest. He could serve as a king because he's from Judah, but he can't serve as a priest because he's not from Levi. That is an irreconcilable problem if we're using the law as the standard. So perfectly, God puts this chapter 14 right here, has what he says in through David in Psalm 110, and it tees it up perfectly for the writer of Hebrews to say Jesus can serve as both king and priest because he comes from a line of that Melchizedek served in, and that man Melchizedek was not only a king, but he was also a priest. And so he was a king of a place named Peace, of what we believe is Jerusalem, but he's also a king of righteousness, and he is the king, or the priest rather, who serves God Most High, El Elyon. So in every conceivable way, Jesus is able to do exactly what the writer of Hebrews is saying here, and he's able to point back in their history to something that cannot be refuted. It is a perfect way to say Jesus serves according to a priesthood that predates, it goes all the way back to Abraham, and it predates Moses and the law and the sons of Abraham, the sons of Jacob, the sons of Isaac, all of that stuff. So I hope you're catching why this is so vitally important. Now, let's look at verse 3 one more time. This person, Melchizedek, without father, without mother, again, seen two different ways. We just don't know who they are, or if it is this mysterious person, he has no father, no mother. He comes onto the scene because he is supernatural. Without genealogy, we have no idea where he came from because he's not of a line of people. And then it is translated, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. We know that that is the case of Jesus. Of course, he is eternal. And then, of course, but rather made like the Son of God. And he remains a forever continuing priest. So that would be the line. It would be a line that would be forever a continuing priesthood. Great. Gives Jesus the ability to step right into that. Now, from verses 4 through 10, I'm just going to read all the way through this and then we'll go back to it because this is the second part. And this is the focus of the writer of Hebrews and what he finds or what he believes is the most important part of all of what we've just read. So again, those first 3 verses get the scholars loving to have their debates about who is he and could he possibly be somebody else, and you can read all the stuff that there is on the internet. So what you have here is the writer of Hebrews says, that's all distraction. Let me get to why it's an important thing and why did I bring it up? So let's just ask it that way. Okay, writer of Hebrews, you've given us these first 3 verses. You've talked about this person back there in Genesis, and you've given us the understanding of what really was being meant by Psalm 110. Remember, the Bible is validating the Bible. If somebody said, what is that discussion that goes on in Psalm 110? The writer of Hebrews says, let me settle that for you, and it takes all the other options off of the table. That's the important part, because now the Bible is interpreting the Bible, and whatever anybody else might want to think doesn't matter a bit, because the Bible has closed the loop. It's tied it up, and there is no alternative here. That's so important, and I love that about how God does that with his word. If there's a question, find out where the Bible settles the issue. And in this case, totally settles the issue. We don't have to wonder about who Melchizedek is and why it's important that he's there. We don't have to wonder about that discussion in heaven because the book of Hebrews settles the argument. There is nothing left to debate here. So, in all of that, we get at verse 4. We're going to read through verse 10. That's what we're going to be covering today. Now, consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. Now, the spoils are what was happened in the conquering of those northern kings. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from the brethren, though they have come from the line or from the family of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abram and blessed him who had the promises. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the greater, or the better, or the superior. That is massively important. We're going to come back to it. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abram, so to speak. For he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Now, again, that's a lot of English that's there, and it's like, okay, the way that I set it up is, hey, the writer of Hebrews is going to settle why this is such an important thing. You read through that and go, I have no idea what you just said there. It's because it's kind of clunky in the English, but if you take your time through it, okay, it all makes sense. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this. Why is this important? And again, remember, this is a whole line of discussion, and it's a whole line of explanation that the writer of Hebrews sees as not just important, but it is crucial, it's vital, and it is indispensable. You have to be able to prove Jesus can serve as a high priest, or else everything that you've said is of no effect. So again, the objection from the Jewish person: Jesus cannot be a high priest. He's from the tribe of Judah. He can be a king, but he cannot be a priest. Period. End of story. All right, and it's a valid objection. Writer of Hebrews says, wait a minute, not so fast. There was a priesthood that predates Abraham, or I'm sorry, that predates the law, it predates Moses, it predates the giving of the law, it predates Levi, it predates Aaron. Okay? Who is that and why is it important? Well, Melchizedek was a priest, and it is said of him that his priesthood is forever. It's an unending one, and it because it is in the line of a priest, Melchizedek, who was not only a priest but also who was a king. He held both titles, both offices. And he served not just some God, he served El Elyon, the God Most High. So every qualification for an individual to be able to serve as king and priest has a precedent. In Psalm 110, God speaking says to the Son, Yahweh speaking to Adonai, I have made you a priest according to the order of Melchizedek forever. Okay, great. Now the writer of Hebrews is completely armed with the ability to say, let's consider the greatness of who this Melchizedek was and how it gives Jesus the ability to serve according to that line, and it will make it where he's able to serve that way in that capacity forever. Perfect. Hugely, hugely important. Great. So, with that, let's go back and look at the text. And here's what the writer, again, Jew to Jew, is able to say to them. Consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abram gave a tenth of the spoils. So as they're coming back, and as Melchizedek meets Abram from chapter 14, again, read the whole chapter if you like, and he meets him there. And Abram's reaction wasn't, do you know who I am? Rather, he says, now that I've encountered you, Melchizedek, the right thing would be for me to give you a tenth part of all of our spoils. Now, that's an interesting thing because the tenth is something that we see from the law. That's where it's mandated that people are to give a tenth of what they produce, and it would be a way of supporting the priesthood and supporting the temple and supporting all that. That was how God made sure that there was enough resource for the temple and for the priesthood to function. Well, here is a man giving a tenth part before there was a law written. That's intriguing. That's interesting. But here the writer of Hebrews says, understand how important this is. Abraham, who is as great in the history of the Jews as any person could ever possibly be, yet that man, when he came back from the miraculous victory that he had over the kings of the north, brought back all of those spoils. And when he sees Melchizedek, he sees him as the superior and says, let me offer to you a tenth part, a tithe of all of the spoils. So the writer of Hebrews sees this as not just an important thing, but it is critical and it is crucial, and it is used in the discussion here of saying, you people who are considering going back to the law, you need to stop and consider this for a moment, because this is important. A priesthood that predates, that even Abraham, as great as he is, saw this Melchizedek as somebody who was worthy of offering a tithe. This, again, this man, Abraham would know him. You're the king of peace. You are the king of righteousness. You're the servant of El Elyon, God Most High. And he, this person, Melchizedek, blesses Abram and says, you're the one that God has given this miraculous victory, and God has delivered these men into your hands. That's like the kind of stuff that you hear of them coming out from the Exodus, that God delivered the enemies into their hand. You hear it all the time through that part of their history. But here it's now being said of Abraham, if you'd have gone up there on your own, you'd have been wiped out. But God delivered these men into your hands. And now here, Abram, recognizing that, says, I will give back a tenth part of what God has done. And he gives that to this Melchizedek. Now, verse 5. And indeed, those who are the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, those are the people that according to the law, God says, I'm giving the priesthood to Levi and descendants of Aaron in particular. These are the ones who received the priesthood. It was given to them to be those people. Remember, that's where God says, they won't have a land allotment. I will be their inheritance. They will serve me as my priests. So, They have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the line or from the loins, from the family of Abraham. So in the law, it says, these people, Levi, the people that are the descendants of Levi, they will be my people, my servants, my priesthood, and the high priest would be of the line of Levi, and the people who would serve would be of the sons of Levi, or of sons of Aaron, rather. So in the law, it was said, the support would be that all of the tribes would give a tenth of their income or of the things that they had produced, and it would be given to the priests to help sustain them, but to see to the function as the priesthood, the offerings and everything else there would be a cost to that. Whether it's livestock or whether it's money, it takes those things in order to minister to the people as priests. So that was in the law, put in place, that these things would be there to sustain that ongoing. So again, the writer of Hebrews says, just remember that there was a line and a tithe that was paid by Abraham to Melchizedek, similar to hundreds of years down the road, 500 or so, where the people of the tribes of Israel would be giving to the Levites a tenth part of what they produced in the same manner. So he says, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them, that is the sons of Abraham, or the sons of Jacob rather, that there is one whose genealogy is not derived from receiving tithes of, I'm sorry, I'm reading this too fast. The person being discussed here is Melchizedek, verse 6. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham, and he blessed him who had the promise. So again, Melchizedek realizes who Abraham is. He knows that he's this one that God has given the promise. So they know of one another. This is a way of saying Melchizedek, when he looks at Abraham, doesn't look at him as any person. He recognizes him. You are the one to whom God has given the promise. What's the promise? I'm going to make you a great nation, from you a great nation, and through you the nations are going to be blessed. How ironic if it is, not ironic, but how poetic if Jesus is Melchizedek, an appearance of Jesus as Melchizedek, is able to look at him, and Abraham would be being blessed by the same Jesus who would be the blessing to the nations in that prophecy. When God says, this is what I'm going to do. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. I'm going to make you a great nation. Through you, the nations will be blessed. I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. All of that's there. That's the promise. So when Melchizedek lays eyes on Abraham, he knows who he is. And Abraham seemingly knows a whole lot about who Melchizedek is, because there is this respect that is given to him. I will pay a tithe to you. Melchizedek, I will bless you. And I proclaim a blessing on you. And God has delivered you in your enemies into your hand. The theology behind this is mind-blowing. So, again, since we're talking about who gives tithes to whom and who is greater, who is lesser, that's the whole upshot of what's being spoken of here. So, was there a greatness to the priesthood that God had given through Levi? Absolutely. Was it what God wanted, and is he the architect of it? No question about that. But wow, when you stop to think about this Melchizedek person, the people to whom when Abraham was given the promise, those people that would be down the line, the Levites, the priests, the high priests, ultimately, they come from Abraham, and Abraham saw Melchizedek as his superior. And Melchizedek acted as the superior, the one who blessed. That's what's going to be spoken of here in just a moment. Right here in verse 7, in fact. Now, beyond all contradiction, there's no way to get around this. This is an absolute ironclad perfect truth. He says this: the lesser is blessed by the greater, or the better, or the superior. So what does that mean? Look back at Genesis 14. Who was the one blessing and who was the one receiving the blessing? We already read that. It is that Melchizedek blessed Abram as the one who is favored of God Most High, and he has given your enemies into your hand. And the fact that you're able to bring a spoil and pay a tenth of it is because God has given you that victory. And he recognizes it and sees this Melchizedek and says, I give you a tenth of all of this before anything else. Read the rest of that chapter, and you'll see there that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the others told Abram, hey, you can keep a part for yourself. And basically Abram says, oh no, I don't want any of the things from this. You take all of it. I only want to take care of the men who went with me, what he's given to Melchizedek, but I don't want anything else of the spoils of this, lest you would be able to take credit for what God has blessed me with. It is brilliant and fascinating. But this verse 7 is, again, it is such a monumental thing that is said here. It is so critically important. Look at what he says. Beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. So the participants there in Genesis 14 was Abram and it was Melchizedek. Who blessed whom? Melchizedek blesses Abraham, making him the greater of the two personages. A Jewish mentality, when they hear that, who could possibly be seen as greater than Abraham? How is that possible? Genesis explains it, and there's really no debate in it. It just is what it is. So people can go ahead and disagree all that they want to, but the text speaks very, very plainly. So the writer of Hebrews here says, this is the statement I'm about to make cannot be contradicted. The greater blesses the lesser, period. There's no discussion here. So here he says, here mortal men receive tithes. Speaking of the descendants of Levi and the priesthood, they receive tithes. And it says, but there, back in Genesis 14, the one who receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. So those priests in the lines of Levi, they came and went. They lived and they died. They had a beginning, they had an end. We knew what family they were from. They were from the tribe of Levi. So we'd be able to track down who's the father, who's the mother. What's their genealogy? They're from the tribe of Levi. But looking back at Melchizedek, who's his mother and his father? We don't know. What's his line? What's his genealogy? To whom does he belong? No idea. When did he start? When did he end? No idea. So in every one of those places, the priests that serve under the Levitical priesthood, they were everything that God designed them to be. They were fallible. They, a lot of times, fell into just horrible sin and debauchery even. But nonetheless, they were still of that line. God had set everything in the parameters of it. They could serve for such and such a time. They had to be of this genealogy, Levi, and they would have father and mother because they're not supernatural. They're just that. And again, all of the parameters, we know them. So in this case, when you start to look back at the parameters of Melchizedek, has none of those limitations. It's a forever priesthood. It's not limited. It doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. We certainly know that the Levitical priesthood had an ending. It's not functioning to this day. And when the temple was destroyed by Titus in 70 AD, that was the end of a functional priesthood, and it doesn't even exist to this day. Even though you might be able to show a person is from Levi, even if you could prove that here today, he still couldn't function as a priest. Not only in the practical sense, but in the spiritual sense, God wouldn't recognize it anyway. And the writer of Hebrews is saying that the Levitical priesthood had all kinds of limitations. And so in the priesthood of Melchizedek, no limits. There are no limits to it. So it's forever, it's enduring. And as far as Melchizedek was concerned, we don't know enough about him to say he had a beginning or an end. It's unknown to us at best. If he's supernaturally Jesus, then it's a whole different discussion entirely, because Jesus is himself eternal. He's God. He has no beginning. He has no end. So he fits all of this perfectly. So, verse 9, an interesting, again, addition to it. Even Levi, the one who receives tithes, or his descendants, whether it was the priesthood that started through Aaron, those people that came through that, they received tithes, but they themselves paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak. So that way of saying, even the descendants, because of the actions of their beginning of their covenant, Abram, they by definition would be seeing Melchizedek as their superior. So if Abram paid tithes to them, if it were possible, even the Levites now would be paying a tithe, because that would be seen as not only did Abraham view Melchizedek as the superior, everyone in his line going forward, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to the sons of Jacob, Levi among them, and every descendant thereafter would have to look at this Melchizedek as being the superior. It's such a big deal. I mean, to us, again, to Gentiles, if all we know is pretty much the New Testament, that's not such a compelling thing. But man, when you stop to think about the history of the Jews and the history of Israel and the priesthood and Abraham and all of his descendants, to say everybody from Abraham after him would have to view this Melchizedek as being, if you're a direct descendant of Abraham, superior in every conceivable way, beginning at Abraham and then from there on. For, verse 10, for he, whoever that person is, of the genealogy from the descendants of Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his father, Abraham, when Melchizedek met him. So, the whole line going forward, everybody that has existed from the beginning of the covenant at chapter 12 of Genesis, every single descendant of Abraham from that point on would have to view, as Abraham did, Melchizedek as being the superior. He's the greater. So again, if you're trying to make the case for Jesus and how can he serve as a king and as a priest, the writer of Hebrews says, let's use Abraham as the example. We know who this person Melchizedek is. There's that added layer of of the book of Psalms rather, that says, oh, wait a minute, this person Jesus will be serving according to an order that is greater than that of Abraham or his descendants. Now the Father says to the Son, the Lord said to my Lord, so Yahweh says to Adonai, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So then the writer of Hebrews would be able to say, let's take all of this and put it all in one nice, neat little file, and that Jesus can serve as our king and as our great high priest because he predates anything from Abraham and his descendants and that covenant. He is able to serve as one who could offer himself as a sacrifice, and he can come back as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords because he is after an order that predates the law, and that even Abraham himself would look at and say, he is my superior. So if he was Abraham's superior, then anybody that would come from the line of Abraham would also have to look at this Melchizedek as being the superior. That's looking backward. Looking forward, if Jesus is a king and a priest after the order of Melchizedek, then any of the descendants of Abraham would also have to look to Jesus and say, if Melchizedek was superior, Jesus certainly is. And he's of that line even from the sons and the descendants of Abraham. So he's that bridge between it all. Jesus can be the king and priest, as was Melchizedek, but he can be that forever, and he can mediate as high priest, and he can make offering on behalf of the people, and he can serve as their King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Man, oh man, this is such important stuff. And the way that it's laid out here in Hebrews, once again, it makes the argument ironclad. There's no way around it. And again, since he quotes Psalms and he quotes and he quotes the Psalms, then actually the writer of Hebrews says, I'm going to take all of that, what we know from our history, and I'm going to make an application, and that really makes it where there are no other possibilities. This is the only way that it can be seen. Now, people will be able to say, well, I reject everything in the New Testament. Okay, but you're then stuck at the point of saying, but you don't have a priesthood anymore then. And even Abraham, who, you can make the same argument the writer of Hebrews is here. You've got this person mentioned in Genesis 14 that Abraham looks at him and says, he is my superior. And what we know about him, he's greater than anything that we can possibly know. He is even superior to the priesthood that wouldn't come for 500 years later. Melchizedek would be able to stand above that priesthood because it had no limits. And that priesthood of Melchizedek was also a kingship. And everything about it just shows superior, superior, superior. That's why the writer of Hebrews could make the arguments that he does. And it is fascinating and it is mind-blowing. So we're going to pick up at verse 11 next week. Again, this kind of deep dive into Melchizedek. He has a lot more to say about him. And this is where the whole question of the priesthood really kind of starts to pick up some steam. So these next chapters are fascinating, and some of the most detailed, the most intricate, the most important theology that we find anywhere in all of God's Word. So we'll pick up at verse 11 rather next week of chapter 7. And look forward to doing that with you. Please go ahead and read ahead. It is, again, fascinating reading. Go back and read all of Psalm 110. Go back and read all of Psalm 2. Go back and read all of chapter 14 of Genesis, and it'll just give you more detail than what we were able to cover today. So we'll pick up there next week, and I look forward to studying it with you.